Zones. Uh, Thank you for the reminder. My name is Saqib Haq. I'm from the International Center for Climate Change and Development, ICAD. So today we're very pleased to have our panelists come in and talk about a very innovative topic that we think is very timely coming out of the UNFCCC COP conventions on climate change, where we'll be discussing the issue of loss and damage, as it has now become quite a major trending issue globally as well as nationally. It's been a long-standing issue for particularly the LDCs and SID communities. What we would like to be doing is, now that the issue of loss and damage has trended into 3 different entities from the UNFCCC, there are mandates and there are activities and work plans from various different perspectives on how to address loss and damage, not just minimize and avert, but particularly on addressing it. And for those of you that are familiar with our center and our work, our founder and director, Professor Salim Ul Haq, has been a long-standing advocate for addressing loss and damage. And sadly, he's not with us at the moment, but would have been delighted to have seen that the loss and damage issue is taking center stage, not only in terms of the thematic areas that we've been working on in terms of research and development from the Excom and the WIM Excom, as well as the SNLD, the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, but also looking at the funding, the Loss and Damage Fund that has recently been announced out of the convention and been given a capital investment at this COP, a rather unprecedented moment of announcing a pledge at the opening session. So I don't think that's been ever happened before, but we're hopeful that the funding is something that will be continuing to come through every opportunity that we're able to advocate for more funding for loss and damage for the communities that are affected. We're hopeful that we'll be able to get in a lot more innovative projects coming through in addressing it, and hopefully over time not have as many things become loss and damage, try to be adaptive and resilient to the impacts that are happening. So we're very delighted to have some representatives from the 3 entities. As I mentioned, the Warsaw International Mechanism has an executive committee on loss and damage, which has been one of the early long-standing stages of addressing loss and damage at the political international level. There's also been a network called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, and we have some representatives from that to let us know a little bit about the activities of that network in terms of research and collaboration with other civil society networks, and then some representatives and people that have been closely following the development of the Loss and Damage Fund. As I mentioned, it's just been announced. They're still working on the secretariat and the board of the fund, but we're hopeful that within this year, there'll be some good strides before COP29 on the Loss and Damage Fund being established and having some clear mandates. So what I would like to do now is for the people that are experts on these areas, far more knowledgeable about these topics than myself, to give us a little bit of an understanding and a grounding about the entity that they have been closely following in terms of what is the mandate that that entity, whether it's the Excom, the SNLD, or the Loss and Damage Fund, what mandates have been given to them, what areas have they already started to work on, and hopefully through the course of this session today and further conversations to come along this is how these entities can be collaborative rather than having to duplicate work or to look at areas where they're sort of siloed and working in their own ways without being collaborative and cohesive. What are some of the ways that we might be able to foster a little bit of thinking amongst these entities? Where are the sort of action points that we might be able to target within the work plans of these different entities and their mandates, and how civil society networks might be able to support and activate some of the work that they're doing, get involved in some of the policies that they're trying to develop, and also be able to avail some of the funding and be able to keep our initiatives going forward. So with that, I'd like to start the first segment where we hear a little bit about the overview of the entities so that everybody joining in from this session, as well as the recording that we'll be able to get out of the session here today, are able to use this to get an understanding about the different areas of loss and damage and how it's sort of starting to spread out into different modalities. What are these mandates and these entities, and an overview of some of those areas. So I'm delighted to invite our first speaker, Advocate Hafiz Khan, who's one of the Excom members and loss and damage negotiator, a long-term loss and damage negotiator from Bangladesh. Hafiz Bhai, if you'd like to give your remarks, please.
Thank you, Saqib, and hello, everyone. I'm really excited to see Lian and Ritu particularly, because we worked together very closely last year to develop the fund and funding arrangement ideas within the transitional committee meetings. So yeah, I also would like to thank ICAD and Sakib particularly to think about this juncture of the climate change global governance, because colleagues, you know that if you look back to the history, then at COP28, Doha, we negotiated whole night just to agree on a simple word, that is international mechanism. And Doha, that was the best achievement for developing country negotiators to get only the word international mechanism. Then like Lian and me, we worked throughout last year, very hard for designing the recommendations of the Transitional Committee. Same, we did it the year of 2013. Whole year, we tried to understand what is that international mechanism and what should be the skeleton. Then interestingly, Salimul Haq, what Sakib said about his legacy, Salim invited to attend a workshop just before the Warsaw International Mechanism adopted at COP13 in Bellagio. And he invited all the negotiators from developing country, including our then leader, one who was the coordinator for G77 in China, and some of the experts like Coco Warner and others. So we spent 5 days in Bellagio to draft a skeleton. What will be the international mechanism? Then we came to Warsaw. So with that note, I do recall Salim's huge contribution throughout the last 13, 14 years for developing the loss and damage global structure. So, you know, colleagues, at this moment, loss and damage is very sensitive, very critical issue. But if you look at the governance structure, this is one of the best regime, I would say, within the UNFCCC mechanism. Why? We got an international mechanism that is called Warsaw International Mechanism. Then we established an executive committee under this Warsaw International Mechanism that is acting as a policy arm. Then again, we established the Santiago Network that is acting as a technical arm of this Warsaw International Mechanism. So we got 2 arms under this international mechanism. One is the Excom, second is the Santiago Network. Thirdly, we established the fund. Interestingly, fund was not adopted under the Warsaw International Mechanism. It was directly adopted under the COP and CMA. Even Santiago Network was adopted through the COP decision, but Santiago Network will be working through this Warsaw International Mechanism. Finally, now what is the needs? Last 30 years, or particularly loss and damage, last more than a decade, we are negotiating to structure the global governance. To understand the global governance, we can try to understand our needs at the national level. We need to access the technology, we need to access the financial resources, and also we need to access the capacity building support. Those are the issues I would like to discuss very briefly. Taurin, may I request you go for the next slide? So this is the infographic, actually, what I already talked about. Under the COP and CMA, colleagues, you know, the Warsaw International Mechanism was established under the convention or UNFCCC. However, when we adopted the Paris Agreement back in 2015, this Warsaw International Mechanism also anchored by the Paris Agreement. So this is the institution that is now regulating by both the convention and the Paris Agreement. So that's what we call dual agreement. But we all know that the developed country parties particularly would like to govern this international mechanism solely under the Paris Agreement. Because why? There is an accompanying decision in the Paris Agreement, that is 1CP21. Para 51 said that Article 8 of the Paris Agreement does not give us any basis for liability and compensation. This is the main issue. The developed country parties would like to avoid the governance guidance from the convention. They want only solo governance from the Paris Agreement. Anyway, still it is dual governance, and you will find all the decisions equally mirrored in COP decision and the CMA decision. That's very interesting, but that is not the case for today's presentation. Just I gave you the overview so that you do understand the current state of political discourse in the loss and damage policy regime. So I already talked of the executive committee. Sakib said, luckily, one of the members of this executive committee. Executive committee is working 5 other expert groups, like expert group of non-economic loss and damage, expert group on comprehensive risk management, expert group on that is the displacement, a task force on displacement. So these are the expert groups. Basically, they are really expert, globally expert on this issue, are closely working to develop some tools and methodologies, particularly to understand the loss and damage, to assess the community needs, to assess the needs for technology, to assess the needs for finance. So Excom is now playing a very important role in terms of developing some sort of technical policy guidance for the national states. But again, challenge would be to translate those tools and methodologies, taking into account the national circumstances. That's our first challenge at the national level. Second, Santiago Network was established in Madrid, 2025. But slowly Glasgow agreed for the function, Sharm el-Sheikh agreed for the institutional structure, and finally we got an advisory board for the Santiago Network. We got a secretariat that is also hosted by the UNDRR and UNOPS. Just to note it, these UNOPS and UNDRR, they also propose some technical working group where ECARD and IID would be partnering with the UNDRR to deliver this, catalyze this technical assistance. That's very interesting. Now, this independent secretariat, guided by an advisory board, it would like to provide the technical assistance to the vulnerable communities and the states. Now, challenge is they're gonna provide this technical assistance to OBNEs, that is organization, bodies, experts, and networks. So to identify those OBNEs and provide technical guidance, also there is a need for financial mechanisms to develop under this Santiago network. So advisory board is working. They is going to meet in this year in Geneva. So they will develop further modalities, how to utilize our effective ways to use of the secretariat and OVNs. So this year is really critical to develop further governance modalities for Santiago network. Finally, fund and funding arrangement. We all know that at COP28, we agreed the recommendations put forwarded by the transitional committee, but there are many challenges that remain there because the board that is established at COP28, they need to negotiate with the World Bank so that World Bank operationalize this fund in accordance with the conditions provided by the COP28 decision, particularly cover decision para 21. There are 11 set of conditions. World Bank needs to meet those conditions, and then they can operationalize the fund. So this year is really critical, particularly for the governance structures, modalities to be developed. So now another big challenge, it is that what's the international mechanism is there, there are two arms are there, also the fund and funding mechanism. It looks like a complete institutional structure. Now, when there are many more governance structures, big challenge remain always their coordination. The first challenge is how to coordinate these three different institutions and with three different mandates. Excom will provide policy guidance, Santiago network will catalyze technical assistance, fund will provide the financial resources. Now, challenge, you now come to the local level. For example, Bangladesh, one of the most vulnerable countries, Communities need to get financial resources. Communities need to get the technical assistance. Community needs to get the policy support. Now, there is a challenge for coordination at the global level, at the same time national level. With that said, Taurin, would you please go for next slide? So if we understand the global structure, then it would be easy to design the national structure. So then again, Professor Salimullah Haq advocated for many years now to develop the national mechanism for loss and damage. And what was his rationale, or our understanding is that we always now do say three words: access, access, and access. We need to access the political guidance, we need to access the technology, we need to access the capacity building. So to access those assistance, we need to think about an institutional structure at the national level. However, that should be a kind of multi-actor partnership, because there are many stakeholders at this moment working at the national level: NGOs, CSOs, academics, also of course policymakers. So there should be a multi-actor partnership. That's why national mechanism is really needed. Second, what I want to say, there is a need for evidence-based approach. So we need to, what I already talked about, the assessment, we need to translate in global standard tools and methodologies, considering the national circumstances. Most importantly, COP28 decision regarding fund and funding arrangement, there is a clause that community can access this fund. Now challenge how to prepare your communities. How we know the communities, they don't have the capacity to access the global funding resources. So we need to empower the communities. And what would be the strategies to empower these communities so that they can access the resources directly? So community power empowerment is very important. Finally, like OBNEs, ICARD, IID, those can be OBNEs. And those as a OBNEs, they can also need to work closely with the communities to meet the needs of the vulnerable communities. Taurin, would you please go for next and last slide? Taurin? Okay, and just some sort of forward-looking thoughts. We need to develop programmatic approach that COP28, also fund and funding arrangement agreed for trigger-based and programmatic approach. Trigger-based approach is needed to meet immediate needs of the community soon after an event. Secondly, programmatic approach particularly is needed for the slow onset processes like sea level rise. We need to develop short-term, mid-term, long-term programs so that those programs can be submitted to the fund. Fund can provide us direct budget support. I'm sure Lian will tell about it more from the financial perspectives. Then there is a need for integrated and coordinated approach, which is very important for us. So at the national level, we need to develop some sort of integrated and coordinated institutional approach. Also at the global level, there is a need for coordination. And I think last 30 years, we are involved with the negotiation with top-down approach. Unfortunately, this is the time we need to take about the bottom-up approach so that we can understand the community needs, and those needs to be communicated to the global political regime, and COP and CMA decisions needs to be developed further based on the needs of the communities. So this is the time to take paradigm shift from top down to bottom up approach. I would like to stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafiz Bhai. I think that was a very comprehensive overview of the different entities, and thank you for the graphic. I'll be quoting you on that graphic when I use it next time. So I'd like to now move on to our next speaker, Ms. Ritu Bharadwaj, who is the principal researcher for climate change at the International Institute for Environment and Development based in London. who's also been working on loss and damage issues from the civil society networks. And perhaps, Ritu, if you could maybe give us a little bit of a basis on the loss and damage processes that we've been doing on the civil societies and our alliances going forward. If you could hand back to me at the end of your remarks, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shakib, and also to Hafiz for providing such an excellent overview. And I'll start with what we started doing along with ECAD about 4 years back, and especially with Salim's leadership. You know, at around 4 years back, and allow me, Shakib, to just give a little bit of background there, is about 4 years back, loss and damage still is a little bit contentious issue. It was a really sticky issue. None of the donors came forward to give us any fund around that time. So we had to make do with very little funding that we got from one of the philanthropies. And what we focused on was not to engage with and nothing against the negotiators. In fact, they've been taking forward this march for last 30 years. But we thought, and Salim especially mentioned, that there are communities which are suffering on the front line. And what is that we are doing for them right now? Because the COP negotiations will go on and it might take some time. We need to really support the communities at the front line of these impacts. So we started with this process of organizing deliberative dialogue, because if you, at that time, over 4 years back, if you go back and look at in all the research papers that were coming out, most of them talked about theoretical approaches for tackling loss and damage. None of them really talked about what the reality was on the ground. And in this case, we really wanted to go and engage with the development practitioners, people who are managing the health program, education program, humanitarian assistance, people who really go on the front line when a crisis strikes a community. And we wanted to understand from them that when a loss and damage kind of an event occurs, either slow onset or rapid onset, how does the community really react? How do these agents of development, whether it's government or many of these humanitarian assistance agencies or development practitioners, how do they really go on the front line and support them? And what came out was very startling. And from that, we organized a series of 4 deliberative dialogue, which was on what are the realities of loss and damage, because loss and damage does not impact the same community in the same way. There are different groups within the community which gets impacted in different ways. Second was what action and support is really needed to support those on the front line. Third, how can we deliver them? And fourth, how can we finance them? And with those 4 approaches, and I'm really happy that many of those things that came out from informal spaces landed up actually in formal negotiation spaces. For example, something like mosaic approach of funding that came out first from some of those deliberative dialogue discussions. And also like the focus of social protection becoming so important, especially in terms of practical solutions for loss and damage. So with all of this collective wisdom, last year, and as I said yesterday as well, it is exactly 1 year since we launched the All Act initiative under the leadership of Salimul Haq. It was called Alliance for Locally Led Transformative Action for Loss and Damage. It was just ECAD and IIED starting this initiative, but along the line, we have got so many other delivery partners, knowledge partners, innovation partners from the ground level joining this collaboration. And what we are what we proposed within that was to do exactly what Hafiz mentioned, something that we started almost 1 year back itself, where we talked about creating national facilities for loss and damage, because we were mindful that many of these existing funds, whether it's GCF, whether Green Climate Fund, whether it's Adaptation Fund, they are marred with a lot of complex processes and principles, and that makes it so difficult for any of these least developed countries or small island states to access the fund in a timely and effective manner. Just to quote one example, in GCF, or LDC, least developed country, it takes almost 5.5 years for an LDC to get accredited, submit a proposal, and get the fund actually flowing into the country. And I have quoted this number a number of times. But the point is, will a country receiving a funding 4 or 5 years down the line make any difference to their resilience capabilities? No, because the way the climate impact is increasing in intensity and frequency, what is adaptation today might become maladaptation tomorrow. And many of these proposals come with such rigid boundaries, like this is the proposal you submitted, and this is exactly what you can do with that. We need more flexible funding. So what this All Act said, And this, I would say, was the vision of Salim, was we try to get away, go beyond the mindset that tries to define these funds on the basis of the funding mandate, rather that this is loss and damage fund, this is adaptation fund, this is green climate fund, rather being dictated by the mandate of fund, be dictated by the priorities and the needs of the community. And second is, we look at these issues in a more holistic fashion. So something what Hafiz also mentioned was do a more bottom-up planning. So within this National Facility of Loss and Damage, where almost 8 LDCs and SITs have come forward and is working with us, is to do a comprehensive risk management planning bottom-up with the community and with the support from all the civil society and grassroots organizations, grassroots women's organization, do a bottom-up planning process. But what our mandate is for the governments to then harmonize the governance of existing funding resources, because even government, without the support from any international community or any international funding source, governments in many of these countries, you look at Bangladesh, you look at Malawi, Senegal, all of these countries, in the absence of any loss and damage fund, they're already using their social protection program. They're already using the contingency finances to reach out to the community in times of need, or to deal with or to address loss and damage. What we are intending is how can they best bring together a lot of these different funding sources in a national facility, so that when they have that bottom-up plan coming up from the community level, they have these harmonized governance of programs, so they can then link those funding to the exact different types of projects that need them. So proper matchmaking of funding can happen there. And our hope is that once this loss and damage fund board becomes they start to meet and this fund becomes operational, that this fund will be able to provide support to these countries who have already created these national facilities. You can call it anything, a national process where the countries bring together their own different resources, but there are bound to be gaps within their need and actual demand. So if those gaps can be filled from loss and damage fund to help these countries build longer term resilience capabilities. So that is one aspect. Second aspect is what I actually am going to put in a link to a blog that I wrote recently, which is about this loss and damage fund will have to look at two types of funding window. One is for longer term resilience building, where they can use the existing national facilities to put their funding in, so that the countries have the flexibility to mix and match, blend that finances with the existing sources of finances to support longer term resilience building. The second aspect would have to be immediate response to some of these crises that occurs. And that has to be trigger based. That has to be direct benefit transfer to the community. And that has to be based on predefined risks parameters. So how can we really do like when I wrote this blog, I got some feedback on that and saying, this is not possible in LDCs and SITs. Probably there's a lack of awareness. There's so much that LDCs and SITs are already doing. Some of the best, they have digitized, they have created elaborate social registry. They have not just created registries, they have digitized them. They're already using these registries to reach out to the communities in times of need. What is needed is for them to then, the countries which do not have, support them to create such registries, but also overlay the climate risks and risk over on top of these registries, so they exactly know which are the geographies most vulnerable, which are the people within those geographies which are most vulnerable, and to what trigger point or what threshold will they become, beyond which they might become vulnerable to a crisis or a climatic impact. So if they've already predefined these things, they have these things ready. So whenever a crisis hits, we can request the loss and damage fund to directly release the fund to these communities. Again, how do you release the fund directly to these communities? Now we have ample examples. For example, I'll just give the example of India, where direct benefit transfer is being done to the individual bank accounts of the beneficiary. Now, over the course, there is a proper impact assessment which says Government of India has saved around 13 billion US dollar. Billion is a huge amount. And we are talking about 800 million in loss and damage fund. So imagine the amount of money that can be saved from leakages from other administrative layers in administration. But one can say, like, not LDCs may not have the wherewithal or the local delivery system. So where it is not there, we have ample example where communities have been given prepaid cards. They have mobile banking systems, like Cambodia during time of COVID crisis. They immediately transferred the benefit to individual beneficiaries through mobile banking. And so there are ways in which that hurdle can be tided over. But I'm saying if we have that vision of direct benefit transfer to the community straight from the loss and damage fund, when a crisis hits them, that will be a big change. And I'm not saying that let's do it everywhere. Hafiz has been part of the negotiation. He understands the bigger issues, but probably we can pick up some LDCs and SITs to start experimenting or start doing an early pilot so that we can learn the issues and challenges and prepare the rest of LDCs and SITs to be more prepared or have the readiness in them so that similar approaches can be scaled up in those countries. So I'll stop there, Shakib. There's a lot that, government alone, you asked me about what civil society role can play. None of this can be done by the government without the support of the civil society, without the support of grassroots NGOs or local think tanks. But we have to be around a system that asks for a real transformative change to the way some of these funds and bodies work, especially when we're talking about Loss and Damage Fund or the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage. I'll stop there, Shakib. And then over to you, back to you. And any question, I'll be more than happy to respond.
Thank you, Ritu. And then again, on the second segment, when we're talking about specifically on areas of being able to help, I'll tag you in for some of the civil society ways that we've been discussing on how we might be collaborative and supportive for the government to rely on. I'll now move on to our next speaker, Samuel Okori, who's the research coordinator for the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition and recently a youth member for the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage Advisory Board. Samuel, floor is yours. If you can hand back to me at the end of your remarks, please.
Okay, thank you so much, and good day, everyone. Yeah, like I've heard a lot of tangible information from the two previous speakers, from Ritu and from Hafij, and I would just like to say that I was also like a loss and damage consultant for the IIED before, and it's been a wonderful experience working with Ritu. Also, beyond just that, also developed a case study with the IIED on non-economic loss and damage. So working with Rita has always been an awesome time. And hearing her share a lot of insights like really grasped my attention, especially when she talked about the direct benefit transfer. I think that I wrote that it would be a game changer, in addressing loss and damage, especially at local communities, which will help them have access to this fund using the bottom-up approach. And talking of which, Hafiz also mentioned about how the Santiago Network on loss and damage came about. And I would just like to spotlight a lot of things, adding from where he stopped as well. And just to mention that the Santiago Network is beyond I just feel the Santiago Network plays more like a middleman role between the WIMP, Excom, or the WIMP itself, which is the executive committee as well, and the loss and damage fund. Because when you look in between the WIMP and the loss and damage fund, in between is more of the body that catalyzes a lot of resources when it comes to technical assistance, when it comes to providing those real-time data, when it comes to providing the real-time knowledge, when it comes to bringing exploring activities or actions that could help people address loss and damage. And that is what the Santiago Network is all about. While the Santiago Network has received some budgets allocated to it to facilitate its operationalization, however, it can also disburse some little grants, let me use that word, in providing technical support to communities. However, this is at a very low scale. The Loss and Damage Fund provide funding at a bigger or a broader large scale, and that is more like a game changer. And with the synergy of these three bodies, in which I believe that the Santiago Network does not operate in isolation of the WIMP. Likewise, the Loss and Damage Fund does not operate in isolation of the Santiago Network and also of the WIMP. I believe with the synergy of these three entities, it will be a great impact in addressing loss and damage. Let's take, for instance, the WIMP, which does more with the policy aspect, and then we look into the Santiago Network, which does more into the research and getting the data, bringing expert knowledge. Right now, beyond just the expert knowledge that we provided by the Santiago Network on loss and damage, we also have knowledge from organizations. Like we'll be having ICAD there, we'll be having IIED, and beyond just that, even with other organizations, which include local, national, regional organizations who will also be there. And part of the thing about the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage is that each meetings is not just exclusively for the board, but each meetings, they also seek to invite other bodies to attend, which include expert professionals, agencies, bodies, even people from the government to attend. And this will help facilitate a lot of things when it comes to addressing loss and damage, because part of what we need right now, beyond just knowing that this thing is happening, but is also knowing that it does not, what's the pace at which loss and damage is occurring keeps getting even higher, and it's scary and leading to a lot of existential threat and risk. And then highlighting some of the things that that was mentioned by Fitch, I would also like to say that the coordination of all this, helps to address the work, help to come into or incorporate into the work plan of WIMP. Because when you look at WIMP work plan for every 5 years, they bring out some major items or major agendas which they want to focus on for the next 5 years. And the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage incorporates most of these things into its own broad spectrum of the work they'll be doing in the coming years. And apart from that, the Santiago Network also utilizes a lot of approaches beyond just the UNFCCC platforms, but they explore other approaches to make sure that they are able to facilitate technical assistance, help organizations, and even provide skills in addressing climate change in this loss and damage. And they also facilitate collaboration. I won't forget to add that the Santiago Network facilitates collaboration between bodies. For instance, they can look at transformative adaptation approaches, because that was just to bring in this. There was a workshop I attended in Maldives that looked into the global goal on adaptation, and part of those work were more of transformative adaptation approach in addressing climate change in this loss and damage. And by transformative adaptation approach, does more or looks more into locally led actions that are highly innovative to address climate change issues. And these locally led actions, we've seen projects, for instance, the Great Green Wall. These are part of locally led action, even though the Great Green Wall does more with reforestation, restoration of lost ecosystems, and biodiversity. These are also part of the things we are looking at for, because, for instance, communities that are majorly focused on fishing as part of their livelihood, but cannot do that anymore. We are already seeing in that community loss of biodiversity, and beyond just loss of biodiversity, but also escalating unemployment, escalating even some mental health issues. Part of a case study I carried out with IIED in my country, we saw a lot of things that are actually bizarre in the sense that people are actually facing these particular issues, but there is no way for them to source help. There's no way for them to even get help. There is no resources for them to look or fall back to. And that is what the Santiago Network will be providing: those resources, those skills, and capacity building works. And synergizing these three agents, or these three bodies, let me use that word. And I always like to say that the Santiago Network is not in isolation of the WIMP, but synergizing these three bodies will help bring a three-tiered approach in addressing loss and damage, which is not in isolation of any of the bodies. So they work hand in hand. Once the Santiago Network brings its assistance, locate where those resources are, incorporate them, provide real-time data. It will facilitate or fast-track decision-making process from WIMP, and it will inform the loss and damage fund on necessary initiatives that needs to be upscaled or that needs to be, established as a new approach in addressing loss and damage. And it will also inform them of the kind of funding that communities need. For instance, if communities that are highly impacted by, non-economic loss and damage, through the work of the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, and reflecting back on some of the discussions and relevant policies being considered from the WIMP, it will help the Loss and Damage Fund, especially the board, to know, okay, these are some of the initiatives that these communities need in addressing loss and damage, and these are some of the materials being provided by the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage that can be incorporated into these communities. And by so doing, we have three-tiered approach from up. We have bottom top and top bottom approach in addressing loss and damage squarely, and part of which include that the Santiago Network will not just work at the regional level, but we work even at the local, the national, and the regional level. Like, it cross across everywhere, and this does not negate the important role of youth when it comes to addressing loss and damage, because I like bringing in that element, since a lot of discussions have been going on and there has been a lot of research. Yes, there has been a lot of work, but we can't negate the role of youth, who are the powerhouse in initiating and catalyzing action, physical action on ground, especially when it comes to this particular age where climate change is spreading sporadically across region. Like, there is no region right now that you can tell me that is free from being impacted by loss and damage, or that is immune. Yeah, let me use that word. There is no region that is immune from climate change induced disasters. And when we talk about climate change, it's not just something that is happening, it is induced. And that is why part of the loss and damage fund, when it was, it went through the first TC, second TC, third TC, to the fourth TC, that was when we started hearing changes of language that, the loss and damage fund could be a charity fund. It's just like a support. So countries don't really want to take responsibility for their actions. They feel some of the things, or most of the things that are happening, is a natural disaster, and that is bizarre. Like, to hear that when you emit a lot, you feel it's just that way. And beyond just this, I would just like to add that there is a great need for financial reform of international financial institutions. There is great need, because since the loss and damage fund will be operated by will be hosted as an interim, host, which is the World Bank. There is great need for the board to call for financial reform of the World Bank in its operation in developing countries, because part of this has to do also with the disbursement of this fund, which also the Santiago Network will help inform the board as well about how funds should be rolled out on different bases, based on vulnerability, based on risk management, and based on existential threats. Because when you are rolling out funds to countries without actually knowing the vulnerability rates of those communities, you may end up missing a lot of data. And that is also part of the thing that the loss and damage the Santiago Network will be doing, providing real-time data. Part of the issues we have in the climate change space right now is accessing real-time data. There is no uniformity of data. Today you see a different data, tomorrow you see. So the only place we rely on real-time data is from the IPCC, and that may not even be sufficient enough, because there are communities who are at the very, very low hierarchy, that are not even heard of or are not even seen, especially those indigenous communities and all. The SN network, the Santiago Network, will incorporate this knowledge, this locally led knowledge, this locally led adaptation into its own scope, as well as providing it to all bodies, which is the WIMP and the fund, which will help them to address issues in larger scale. And I will round up by saying that identifying youth space is very, very important. I remember before the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, the fund was formed. I remember from COP25, which was 2019 in the Santiago network was established from COP25. And in COP26, I remember as well the first meeting that came on with the parties. Beyond just that, even the EU played a major role when it comes to the Santiago network on loss and damage, and what parties discussed as need for them to establish the loss and damage, the Santiago network on loss and damage. And I also remember the Latin American meeting that was held last year to broaden to look into the works of countries, of organizations when it comes to providing technical support in addressing loss and damage. And moving towards COP27, where the loss and damage board, where the loss and damage, the Santiago network on loss and damage was actually looked into when it comes to establishment of the board. And as at then, I know that a lot of things we are not really certain about youth having a role or not. And honestly, we follow that up and that is also part of what we are trying to do in the loss and damage fund, because giving a platform is good, but identifying the need for youth to be part of that platform makes even more sense, because at the end of the day, youth will not just help to fast track the process, but we help to ensure more accountability. We help to ensure that action is done on ground. We help to get those real-time data. We help to give those real-time informations, because when it comes to the use of technology, when it comes to the use of AI, right now you need to start incorporating the ability of youth into most of these things. And I know that before the end of this discussion, we'll be able to make useful progress. However, it doesn't negate the fact that these three bodies have to come together to work hand in hand in making sure that there is a great reduction when it comes to climate change induced disasters. Why the Santiago network on loss and damage looks into catalyzing actions that avert, minimize, and address climate change induced disasters, especially in most affected communities. Through their work, it will help inform this loss and damage fund, and they will unnecessary actions, unnecessary policies, necessary funding mechanisms or disbursement approach, which could include, like for the loss and damage fund, part of the disbursement approach, larger funding scale, insurance, capacity building. These are some of the activities that the loss and damage fund seek to provide, and beyond just capacity building, but even research. So through that, knowing that the Santiago network engages in most of these things, it will bring about collaborative efforts in addressing this catastrophic issue we are facing today. Thank you. And I look forward to any question or, anything that you may not have any clarity on as we proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. And also, I'd like to mention for those of us that are in the chat, please do feel free to put any comments or questions that you do have for any of the speakers. And if you are unable to get anything answered during our session, please do use the community boards on the HOBA platform for the conference, as well as please to try and reach out to us on the platform and give us any messages or comments that you would like with the speakers. We'd be happy to facilitate anything that we can do on the messaging boards as well. So I'd like to now call on our next speaker, Mr. David Kaluba, who's a climate finance negotiator for the LDC group and also a member of the Loss and Damage Fund board. David, I'm so sorry. I know you do have to head out, so please, thank you for taking the time. The floor is yours if you could hand back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm happy to see that Afij is there and Lian Dian is there. So if I miss out on anything, I know that you're in capable hands. The two are going to cover the whole ground. So happy to see all of you, and I'm happy also to be associated with the work that Salim was doing. In fact, I'm actually an alumni of ECAD. Maybe you didn't know that. I think Afij and myself, I'm not sure if you were there in Bangladesh. When we talked about the loss and damage, you mentioned Coco Wana. I was and the work that she was doing since then. I think it might have been now, could be about 10, 15 years ago, if I remember well. Yeah, so yeah, we'll miss the work that Salim was doing. He did an incredible job representing the needs of developing countries, and particularly the developed countries in many ways. He was a big voice on adaptation and loss and damage. Yeah, so I think for us who are in the board and those of us that participated in the transitional committee, it's the question of coordination and arrangements have been comprehensively covered in the governing instrument. So there is funding arrangements that are also there, and both the Santiago network and the WIM featuring very prominently there. There are so many paragraphs that are relating to the need for coherence and complementarity, the involvement of relevant institutions. In fact, there is also provision for establishment of a consultative forum, which the fund will have to embark on, which will have CSOs and NGOs, trade unions, indigenous peoples, the youths and women, and also a lot of collaboration with what is called the funding arrangements in terms of the roles of the bilateral and regional bodies, and many other things. In many ways, we're going to spend a lot of time on how to figure out how this is going to work. And remember also that there is a high-level forum or platform that is also provided for under the funding arrangements, where we'll have, again, the roles of the WIM and the Santiago network and the partnerships, all that being rolled out. So there's a dialogue for 30 high-level representatives of entities engaged in loss and damage financing. So I think specifically the WIM is expected to perform some particular roles, for example, to develop standard procedures, under in paragraph 10 of the funding arrangements, and to identify sources of funds, processes, and initiatives. So specifically within this loss and damage in arrangements and funding arrangements, the WIM will have certain functions to play. So which means they're not really external or on the side, an integral part of what will be happening. And that will be done also in collaboration with the fund. And I'm sure that some of the work the WIM will do and then pass on to the Loss and Damage Fund Board, and some of the work the Santiago framework is going to, Santiago network is going to also undertake, and it relates that with the WIM and also with the loss and damage funding. I think the issue is, what are those elements that will be worked on to make sure that this collaboration is working in a very strong, great ways. And I think this is where inputs from experts like yourselves and this discussion becomes important. And I'm sure that this is what Fij has talked about, and the previous speakers have related to in terms of what are some of those practicalities. But being in the board, what is important is, how do we get, this information? As you know, we'll be bombarded with so much to work with and to work through, and so you better be ready to invite us to platforms, and I know Liane knows how to do this well, so that we have a very good hearing of what you'll be saying, because we also we tend to get confused in the politics and miss out on what is important. So So you have a task to make sure that we give you a hearing, and we hear you very well. And I suspect that some of the members of the civil society organizations also be sitting on the board. It depends on how much voice we give you. Sometimes we are blind, sometimes we are late. It happens. So, but you have to keep pushing all of us to make sure that we give you the platform to express yourselves. I like that, Diane. So that's how we operate, and there's a lot of work ahead of us, unless we have started on a. Most of you are aware that we have started on a very confusing note. We don't know when we are going to even have a meeting, the first meeting for that matter, and when the board composition will be concluded. So we are already behind schedule, and it's not looking very good so far. But hopefully we get moving and kicking shortly. But I think those are the things that we need to is to how to move beyond the provisions of what is in the governing instrument of the fund and what is in the funding arrangements. So those are practicalities, practical things. What the inputs from discussions like these will be essential, and I think you have to do a lot of writing and to give us the tools, for us to be able to shape the policies and procedures that will help strengthen this network. But I think so far the starting point is looking very good in terms of the role of the WIM and the Santiago network and many other organizations. And I hope that we don't spend 90% of the time on figuring out how it is going to work. But I think so far so good. So these are the few points I wanted to mention, and look forward to getting some information in our hands on and how best we can support the strengthening of this collaboration. Thank you so much again, and I'm sorry I have another meeting just in a minute's time. I'm not able to stay along too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. And I'll definitely be taking you up on that offer for having a space for sort of creative thinking and knowledge and evidence. And I think us at ECAD and our partners at IID would be very, very interested in having you around as you're having the board meetings or before and after, to be able to provide some actual tangible case studies and evidences that we might be able to support your decisions from the board. Please, from your side, let us know when the board is actually set up and what they'll be doing whenever it kicks off finally. So I'd like to hand over to Ms. Leanne Shalatek, who is the I believe the active observer for the GCF board, or no longer the active observer, but
no longer.
No longer the active board observer, but at the board meeting as we speak. So thank you so much for taking the time, Ms. Leanne Shalatek from Heinrich Böll Foundation. Please, Leanne, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I hope you can hear me right. I have a little bit of background noise, but I hope it's not too bad. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. And as said, I'm at the moment at the Green Climate Fund meeting in Kigali, Rwanda. And I think this is actually probably a good starting point in the sense that when we are talking about the Loss and Damage Fund, it's actually with the background and the experience of the Green Climate Fund and issues and experiences that we have from the Green Climate Fund. And Ritu mentioned some of those, and I have been a long-term civil society observer of the Green Climate Fund, participated in the transitional committee meeting for the Green Climate Fund, as did David, and then have followed it over many, many years as a civil society observer. So I think it's actually crucially important that we apply the lessons learned from what has not worked so well in the Green Climate Fund, but for that matter in other climate funds as well. And as we are looking to operationalizing the Loss and Damage Fund, really leapfrog. I mean, there is no reason to repeat the same mistake, and really to try and see what some of the operational policies and modalities must be to overcome that. But and I know we are talking, and I'm glad that people that are much more experienced than I are in the entire loss and damage architecture have actually made that link. But the Loss and Damage fund is an interesting beast because it sits right at the intersection of two very different mechanisms. And one is the loss and damage mechanism, which is obviously important, which has the WIM and the Excom and the Santiago network and everything that is going on in that context. But it's also an operating entity of the financial mechanism of both the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, which then also comes with a certain set of expectations, obligations, and relationship in terms of other funds. And David already mentioned that part of the operationalization decision and the outcomes that we had of the transitional committee were indeed not just related to what the fund is going to do, but also the fund's role in actually being kind of the core and the center for complementarity and coherence in the broader funding mechanism for loss and damage, and being tasked for that with some very concrete actions that are enshrined under the governing instrument and that are in the funding arrangements decision. So I think it's very important to, again, understand that it sits at the intersection of both of those mechanisms and therefore actually has to work with quite a number of partners. So it will also have to see how it actually collaborates or distances itself, where, you know, the separation or the collaboration is between some of the other existing funds under the UNFCCC, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, but also the LDCF, the Least Developed Country Fund, the SCCF, the Special Climate Change Fund under the CHEF, and then obviously all those players that we have, both plurilateral, bilateral, but also the multilateral players, particularly the MDBs that are looking to go into that space. I want to put a kind of a little bit of a civil society perspective on the Loss and Damage Fund, what we are expecting or what we are looking for going forward, as it also maintains to some of that mandate of collaboration and coordination and making sure, again, that we do better, that we really create a better fund that actually allows for funding directly to go to impacted community, to vulnerable groups, and people that are already on the forefront that unfortunately most of the current funds really don't support in the way they need support, because there is too often a trickle-down understanding. And we have the problem, and this is unfortunately a problem, that it is under the UNFCCC, because that means it's a party-driven fund. And very often we have some limits to what parties are willing, and that includes developing country parties in the terms of what they are willing to do to allow for some of the direct access, enhanced direct access to communities. So some of the things that we are looking for as civil society, and I participated in the transitional committee meeting and worked with wonderful colleagues like Hafiz and others in the transitional committee process for the Loss and Damage Fund, is obviously things like a human rights framing that currently the governing instrument does not have, but I think that is very crucial to understanding communities and people in the communities as rights holders, right? They are not just passive beneficiaries that should receive from the benevolence of whoever makes a funding decision, but they should be empowered and have the right to actually have their needs and priorities brought to the board, literally to the board, and the board responding to it. And so now, as we are looking forward, and David mentioned the first board meeting is not yet set. We're expecting it later in the spring. It might be April until we are having it, which obviously compresses the entire ability of the board to make decisions, of the new board to make decisions before the COP29. And there are a couple of decisions that need to be taken, including as they pertain to the collaboration with the World Bank, the hosting of the fund, the hosting agreement of the fund that needs to be approved by COP29. So it's absolutely important that we start out that very first board meeting on a good footing. And that means, for example, that we look in particularly at the structures for participation and engagement of civil society, and particularly communities from developing countries, from the recipient countries. And unfortunately, I would say under the TC process, under the transitional committee process, we did not have optimal participation. We had restricted participation in terms of just a couple of representatives per UNFCCC constituency. We need a much broader participation. We need to start with webcasting right from the beginning. We need to ensure that there is an opportunity for civil society, for community, for experts to participate, for example, through submissions to help shape policies as it's going to be developed. We have, and that was a push that civil society had that unfortunately was not granted, no direct representation in terms of a voting representation on the Loss and Damage Fund board. Instead, we probably will try to improve upon the model that we have in the Green Climate Fund of active observer participation. But, and this is the core important things, the leapfrogging again, it needs to be much better than the active observer model that we have in the Green Climate Fund, which is not enough and will not do, particularly for community participation. We need to look at what enhanced and simplified direct access procedures look like and can look like. Civil society, for example, pushed for a direct access grant window. It's not quite clear whether we are going to get something like that, or whether the possibility is. However, we are, for example, encouraged that the governing instrument very directly lays out that there has to be small grant access for communities. So the question is now, how do we operationalize that? And will that be through budget support to countries? That might work in some countries better than in others. Let's be quite honest about that. Will that work through basically working through an intermediary, like you do it, for example, in the JEF UNDP through a dedicated small grant program? Or do you really provide the direct access? And again, in terms of devolving climate finance decision-making and empowering the communities, you want to be as directly in terms of access as you can be. On the Santiago network on loss and damage, I think, and thank you, Samuel and others for pointing out its very crucial role. I think, and we have to see how that relationship forms, but it's very clear that what you, for example, have in the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, which is readiness, which is technical support, readiness finance support, is actually the function that could be taken up or will be taken up by the Santiago network. So it's not quite clear yet what the relationship is going to be. Is that a memorandum of understanding? Will the Santiago network on loss and damage be the readiness and technical support provider for the Loss and Damage Fund? Will there be some duplication? Can that be avoided? Those questions are not yet clear yet, but will have to be informed. But the important part is that we are looking at the expertise that is provided, and so that we are not just defining expertise as top-down, you know, the typical consultants that come in and fly in, but we are actually allowing for traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, community knowledge to be recognized and then have a chance to actually define what some of the implementation ways and tools should be. I know you look uncomfortable, Sakib. I had the misfortune, I guess, or fortune, however you want to call it, to be the fifth speaker, but I stop here and hopefully that allows still for some time for question and answers. There are a lot more issues around the Loss and Damage Fund, particularly, and several speakers have mentioned that the fact that it faces quite a complicated operationalization under the World Bank by a World Bank hosted secretariat. But again, it will be particularly important for a number of reasons to stress in communication and outreach that this is a UNFCCC fund under the Paris Agreement, part of the financial mechanism that should make it very clear what eligibility criteria is, that should speak to grant finance provision over a higher concessionality that goes through other providers and a lot of the other issues that we want to see forthcoming under the fund. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Liana. And I agree with many of your points, as well as it's a very nice sort of rounding up of the previous slide when Hafiz Bhai mentioned about how these funding mechanisms and these boards now really need to have bottom-up approaches built into the design of it, rather than it being a top-down approach where they've made the secretariat, the board has been established. We do a 2-year scoping study of how to engage with civil society and local communities. We then do a 1-year review and then a 2-year process of how we integrate this. And in that timeline, then the bottom-up approach is an afterthought after all of these things have happened. And I think it puts it right in the center that, as we've seen for the Santiago network, as well as as the Loss and Damage Fund, as
Can
the
I
board.
just come in on one thing really
Yes,
quickly?
please,
I
go ahead.
just want to say, and I'm sorry, I really believe, and that's just from my experience with the Green Climate Fund this year, and engagement and strong civil society and community engagement. As the first couple of board meetings of the Loss and Damage Fund are coming, it's going to be crucial because it will set basically the core operational policies, and it's very hard once some of the core frameworks are set to come in and change them. So I think we really need a lot of technical input. We need a lot of community strength and push, including to the board members. It's very important that in particular the board members understand that money going to a government is not the same as community support. And so we need them really to be champions for those devolved button-up approaches that, let's be honest, some governments have a natural inclination to see as something that is a little bit further down their priority list. Sorry for coming in again.
Not at all, but absolutely, I take your point, and I think this was also some of the discussions that were happening in the corridors of COP28, where people were discussing about, whether it really means it's a community accessible fund, even if you just give it to a local government or a national government entity. Does that really mean that the communities are able to avail it and they're able to take it as support for their initiatives that they're going? Or will it be the same sort of procedural applicational process that you would do at the national, international level, but it's just a national entity that you're applying to rather than globally? So I think, you're quite right that these sorts of discussions are necessary at the moment as the fund is being established, as the networks are being established. And I believe, as I've pitched before, and our colleagues at IID would happily support as well, we're happy to sort of bring in that evidence as these decisions are being made, have these sorts of discussions and these sorts of roundtables where we're really able to bring evidence to board members, bring it to the governing institutes as they're setting these rules and regulations, and really brainstorm on how we can go beyond these mandates. Look around, as David mentioned, not just be stuck with the guiding instrument and the rules that we've been given, but really try to go to the preamble, look at the higher essence of what these mandates were written about, where we're trying to make impact for communities, with communities that are vulnerable at the forefront. So I'll maybe also pick on a little bit of the points that some of our speakers mentioned, particularly Ritu, as she talked about. Some of the new innovative financing methods that are possibly not used by the UNFCCC bodies and the climate funding realm, but are used in other sectors, perhaps from philanthropies and charities, perhaps from private sector, where there are a little bit more trust-based, where they're a little bit more innovative about delivering down to the community level. And we hope that, again, as we carry on this discussion, this is not just a one-off at this conference here at Gobeshona. This is something that we would like to be continuing as these topics evolve. I have newer and newer case studies about innovative financing methods, working with communities, delivering directly to local grassroots networks, associations, indigenous peoples groups. How are we really able to address these challenges that are being faced by the communities in a timely manner, not waiting for 2.5 years for a funding proposal and an agreement and a board meeting, and then seeing whether that project is still relevant? Oftentimes, a lot of the times, the proposal that was drafted before and then went to the board this year is no longer the project and the site that they're able to really put impact to, and it requires a lot of reshaping. And communities, are at loss for having to wait for that long and not able to really get any support when the funding does come through at the very end. So again, having that discussion at these board meetings and guiding instrument decision tables right now as they're setting it up this year, again, following these conversations, being able to provide evidence. So I think, quite a lot of our participants, even as they've been writing in the chat boxes, would be very, very keen on looking at how they can engage on these sorts of activities, looking at how they might be able to provide support. And one thing that I would also mention to all of our members that are board representatives and committee members, that really there are further discussions for us to be having on how we really devolve these things to the community groups using local networks. And as I mentioned, there are many different models that might be drawn in from the private sector and philanthropic organizations that work outside of the climate realm, perhaps in health, perhaps in poverty reduction, perhaps in education. And there's a lot to be learned on how the climate realm can be really, really reflexive about that. And one of the particular conversations about how funding should be reflexive to communities, a few examples that are coming through are looking at humanitarian sectors, because again, in lots of humanitarian disasters, as we've seen, It's a very short-lived funding, but it's a large pot of funding that gets mobilized instantly as soon as the event has happened. We hear about the floods in Germany and Pakistan and wildfires all across of Europe. And there's organizations and charities and humanitarian aid that's mobilized overnight. And it's very short-lived. It lasts only as long as these events are on the news, on the front pages. So that's the temporal area that we need to work on. How do we make these funding mechanisms and funding support last for the duration of the support that is necessary? But there are a lot to be learned about how to mobilize that amount of funding and give it to communities, give it to local organizations as quickly as possible. And I think there are some innovative areas that we might be able to develop some evidence and guidance for these boards and for these networks to learn from. What are some of the areas that we should be sort of trying within the climate realm? What are the areas and aspects that we should be trying to learn from and implement even in a pilot scale, but then looking at how we can be really delivering at a global scale. So I'm cognizant of the time and that we've overrun a little bit in some of the sections, but I would like to maybe pose a question to our panelists about particularly communities within small island development states, least developed countries, indigenous groups. There has been a lot of talk, and it's come up in many of your conversations earlier, about how these communities and frontline communities, the ones that are facing the impact first and have the least to do about any of the causes of it. What are some of the ways that the loss and damage mechanism, the fund, the committee, the Santiago network, how can we be reflexive in the now or in the immediate future, in the days that they're going to be facing these disasters and unfortunate, impacts that will be happening throughout 2024, 2025, while we're having the broader discussions about the mechanisms and so on? What are some of the ways that we should be really reflexive and being able to support communities and LDCs and SIDS in the immediate future? What are some of the ways that we should be looking in as supporting them? So maybe I'll start on the reverse. Sorry, Leanne, to put you on the spot, but then I'll start with you and then work my way back up the list.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, let's put it this way. The immediate is not going to be immediate for the fund. The fund will take a little bit, whether that's, as some optimists think, might be by the end of the year or early next year. I doubt it a little bit, but anyhow, to be able to provide some initial funding. And I just want to point out that while we had the commitment at COP28 from a couple of countries through pledges for 660 million, those are pledges and only pledges as long as they aren't converted into contribution and signed contribution agreements. I have not heard anything how many of those pledges have been signed already. So that means we don't really know how much money is available other than the pledges, and obviously would also point out that however generous it seems in comparison to other funds, like the Adaptation Fund, for example, which was not even able to fulfill its 350 million fundraising goal for the year, it's obviously just a drop on a hot stone. I mean, we know that hundreds of billions are required, and this is not a capitalization of the fund. So let's also be very, very clear, but that we need an initial resource mobilization or capitalization strategy, including, again, through civil society push and actions, so that that's not forgotten. And a couple of countries that have put money forward, and some of them really pitiful amounts, are not let off the hook. But that's just as a background. But then what can we do? I mean, I obviously think it is important for the Loss and Damage Fund, and that's the only one that I'm going to be focusing on, because that's where I feel I have the most to contribute. I certainly am not an expert in the WIM Excom. I think there it is really focusing on the policy development, on the operational structures that will be set largely and sometimes in kind of the exchange with the World Bank, which unfortunately is probably not open to the public, will be behind closed doors. So we are not necessarily engaged, but focusing on what the structures can do different and bring forward. I think that will, as I said, mean that there should be a lot of technical input coming forward. I would like to see so, and I mean, that is probably possible even with some of the smaller funding amounts that might be confirmed, for the board meeting to convene in board and for the interim secretariat to work, and then the transition to the Independent Secretariat later this year, them really thinking about how they can set a sign, a positive sign, by doing some small scale funding that is actually directly accessible to the communities. And that is probably something that can be done without having to have all operational policies in place. Well, this is still possible. It could be something as simple, you know, as a smaller amount, 100,000 or so, for or some community organizations to actually start implementing some of the activities at the core. And again, that would be setting a sign that the fund is committed to some of those smaller scale direct financing provision, while some of the larger, you know, the larger frameworks probably are still worked out. So that I would see obviously rather sooner than later, but I think the overall structure will take a little bit of time. Certainly this year, and unfortunately, since the board year has started late, we hope to make as much progress as possible by COP29 and continue pushing. I think the pushing part is important, particularly so that we see direct access implemented, which is also something that is the challenge in the discourse with the World Bank, as this is not a normal provision under the World Bank Financial Intermediary Fund Agreement that we have to draft with the Loss and Damage Fund. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. Maybe Samuel, if I can ask you to give some reflections. What can we do in the immediate and in the now to address these challenges that are happening in LDCs and SIDS and indigenous communities? Samuel, if you can hear me.
Sorry, please, can you take that again? Sorry, I think I lost it somewhere.
Sorry, I'll hand back to you. So if you could maybe give us some quick reflections on what is it that we can do in the now? What are some of the things that these three entities should be really doing in addressing the loss and damage issues that are happening for communities in the immediate, considering these entities are very slow moving and they take a long time, UN time, to get any decision and funding out? What can we be doing in supporting these entities, and how can these entities be immediately effective in helping out vulnerable communities and LDCs and SIDS?
Okay, so thank you so much for that question. And then I think part of the things that we can be doing in the now, like there's a whole lot of things we can be doing in the now, but part of which include carrying out surveys. I feel engaging more with the communities that these issues are mostly affected is very, very important, which has to do with identifying who are the most vulnerable and who actually need what, and how can we make sure that this, you know, the necessary resources is accessible to them, because we know the processes it takes for the UNFCCC to, you know, come to an agreement on a particular decision. For instance, even the TC meeting was just to you know, have like TC1, TC2, TC3, and hopefully TC4, and that ends it. Well, we saw TC5 and we saw another TC5 again. So we saw how complex it is to even get a consensus. So for the now, what we need to do is, first, we need to start drafting out necessary structures on how communities can be able to get resources. And beyond just drafting these necessary structures, but also look at the modalities needed to make this accessible to them. Because if we are not able to look into these things now, when the for instance, the loss and damage fund is fully operationalized, this could be a major setback, because there's a lot of instrumentality when you're looking at how to disburse funds. For instance, I know in the UNFCCC, in the TC meeting, part of the major issues that we had was the test or the language that has to do with vulnerability. Who are the most vulnerable? Who are the particularly vulnerable? How do we identify them? And do we think that the loss and damage fund should focus more on developing countries, or should incorporate all countries, as long as they are highly vulnerable, or as long as they are facing climate change induced loss and damage? For instance, like we saw what happened in Texas a few days ago, the wildfire that escalated and consumed over 50 hectares of land, and that adversely would lead to extinction of species. Beyond just that, we are also going to witness loss of biodiversity at a massive rate. And we've also seen catastrophic event in sub-Saharan region of Africa. We've seen catastrophic events in some regions of Asia. So these are things that we need to start looking at. How do we, fast track how do we identify or spotlight communities that are highly vulnerable? How do we, catalyze support to give these communities? And beyond just that, part of the things that we can also start doing at the now is engaging in research at the now, so that once this funding is available, we know that we have every necessary resources needed to start mobilizing and implementing those actions at the forefront, because we cannot be able to negate the effective aspect of research. Part of the issues of climate change is we have more false reports than real reports. So once we are able to carry out this research, then we do more of awareness. There is need for people to start being aware of what is happening in their environment, of how they can be able to engage in the loss and damage fund, because the loss and damage fund and the Santiago network, even in the WIM, they're not in a, it doesn't mean that people cannot be able to support. For instance, the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage will always call for submission of reports, of research papers, of ideas. These are submissions that people will bring in to see how they can be able to incorporate their own idea and match it up with what the board or the secretariat, that is Santiago Network Secretariat, is trying to achieve, which is catalyzing technical support. So that is what is needed for the now. And I'll round up with this last one, which is stakeholders mapping. So there is need to start doing stakeholders mapping, because it's very, very important. If we don't do stakeholders mapping, I feel there will be a lot of gap when it comes to communication. We are looking at bottom top and top down approach, but we can't get that if we don't have strategic stakeholders mapping to know how do we engage with these people at the local community. How do we bridge that gap where the fund is assessed directly by the people, stressing back or highlighting back to what Ritu mentioned, which is direct benefit transfer. So these are things that we should start looking at, because, for instance, we can't really say that the loss and damage fund or the secretariat right now can start carrying out any fiscal activities with their own fund, because every fund needs to be approved by the board. If under the loss and damage fund, it needs to be approved by the board. Under the Santiago Network on loss and damage, it needs to be approved by the advisory board under the Santiago Network. So, and in WASO WIMP, it needs to be approved by the WIMP, which is the executive committee. So everything has to go through a lot of approval process and all. But beyond just these approval processes, what we can do now is to start identifying necessary things needed to catalyze actions, necessary things needed to make sure that once the fund comes up, once the fund is available, then all that is left is just going to the field to implement. And that is very, very key. And I just feel that without us being able to, work tirelessly to make sure that communities that are most affected get access to this fund, it makes the fund irrelevant. Because I wouldn't like to mention a name, but I know there was a time I was engaged with one of the high-level official in Germany, and she was so dissatisfied to tell me that, Sam, the major aspect of the loss and damage fund is not about the fund being approved, but it is all about people who the fund is meant for having access to it, because that is a major issue. So the loss and damage fund, the Santiago network, the WIMP need to come together to devise some mechanisms on making sure that there's a clear mandate, there's a clear line, and there's a clear mandate and a clear guideline that shows how this fund will be disbursed, and that shows how communities, how stakeholders can be able to participate in the whole process. I think that is what is needed at the now, before we start talking about let's start implementing, let's start carrying out action. For highlight, research, stakeholders mapping, and synergy. These are the things that are needed at the now to make sure that there is a good platform, a good ground to usher in the full implementation of the Loss and Damage Fund, the Santiago Network, and the support from WIMP. And just to mention that the Santiago Network will be meeting this next week, hopefully. And part of that meeting will also be stressing more first about the host secretariat, the appointment of the director of the of the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, and how the board will function more to align with most of the demands or most of the items identified by the two hosts secretariat, which is by the two hosts organization, which is the UNOPS, yeah, and the UNDRR. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. And then similarly, I would make a similar offer to you in the sense that when you're having the board meeting, please do mention to the other board members that there are entities like us here at ICAD where we're happy to help you and host these discussion platforms about how these entities can be more cohesive and collaborative. Where are the coordination points that we might be needing between the three entities? And again, we're happy to have any of the board members around to visit some of the sites. We have many of our partners that are in the chat, in the participation in the session right now, who are working right on the ground and able to provide that sort of evidence and able to provide that sort of on the ground experience for board members to understand the urgency and the need and how to bring it down to the local levels. Happy to provide those experiences. So last but not least, I think it's good that we've sort of circled back around where we started. So Hafiz Bhai, I'll give you the final remarks to do, and then I'll do some closing and we can end there. Hafiz Bhai, would you like to have the mic?
Yeah, thank you. I think it was a long discussion and nice discussion, so I'll be very brief. So board needs to develop innovative modalities so that communities can access directly this fund. At the same time, the researchers like research organizations like ICAD, we need to develop some ideas through our research how community can access that fund. At the same time, CSOs, they need to advocate with those ideas at the board meeting. So this year is really critical for fund board, for Santiago Network Advisory Board, also Excom. So I think we all need to act together with a collaborative approach. I thank you. I thank you also, Saki, for organizing this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafiz Bhai, and thank you to all our panelists. I'm really cognizant of the fact that many of you are in other activities and other board meetings and other sessions at the time. So we're really, really grateful for you to be able to take the time out of your busy day and schedules to join us for the session. It is now 8:30 p.m. in the evening here in Dhaka. So I'm very grateful for a lot of our Bangladesh-based and Asia participants who joined in at this hour. And for many of you that are starting your days and ending your working days, thank you for taking the time to join us. As I mentioned, we don't see this as a one-off conversation. This is something that we've launched as a discussion here on the Gobeshona platform this year, but this is something that we will be following up in terms of how these sorts of entities can be more responsive and more reflective to the needs at hand. And these are discussions that we're hoping to have throughout the year, many of them from some of our partners as well on online platforms. So please do look out for any of our social media and our website information about future events that are coming through. Please do feel free to join in, register it, and participate in any of those as you can. Again, I reiterate, please do use the community boards and our online groups for any comments and activities that you would like to share with the speakers. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining, and I'll end the session there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
May I request everyone for a screenshot, turn on their camera.